Hey everybody, Phil here. Everybody wants to know how to adjust to a Maniac, and the answer is it depends. There are different types of Maniacs, and yes, at the very beginning of playing with somebody, you might be able to tell from observing a few hands that they're just putting a lot of money into pots, but you don't have more specifics at that point, and we'll talk about that. But what I want to do today is give three kind of more concrete, specific examples of a type of Maniac, and I've come up with ones that I think are like that I've seen before that are kind of reasonable characters. And then I'll talk about how I would adjust. So first, I'll start with somebody who, he likes to put in a lot of money on each street. He does this by over bluffing. He also does this by just kind of ramming in too much money with pretty good hands. Doesn't overfold, certainly, underfolds, but is not, he's not clueless. He's not check calling flop with no pair, no draw, no hope. But when he's got a little bit of equity, or he senses weakness, or whatever the case may be, he pounces. He's doing so with huge bets, huge raises. The first and most important thing to keep in mind against this kind of player is when they check to you, if you bet, you are opening the door for them to put in a huge check raise. So what's the most obvious adjustment that we make? Well, we bet with a range that is more polarized, because a polarized range likes being raised. If we start going thinly for value, that's a range that does not like being raised. So on the flop, we're going to bet our sets. We're going to bet our top two pair, depending on we're going to bet our straights. We're going to bet our flushes, etc. We're going to bet our very strong hands, and then we're going to bet some bluffs. Now, this opponent is probably not going to overfold, like I said. So we don't want to bluff too much, but you bluff occasionally, obviously. This opponent is not clueless. If they see you just always betting, like always having the nuts when you bet, they're going to catch on. They're going to stop shoveling in 200 big blinds against you. So we need to bluff a little bit. Now, once we check back and we get to the turn, kind of similar logic. Basically, we don't want to open the door for this player to check bomb to whatever 6x pot. So once again, we're betting a pretty polarized range. And what this ends up meaning is that, first of all, we're checking back some decently strong hands that we would normally not check back twice to keep the pot small and go for value on the river. It also means that we're missing some bluffs that have reasonably high equity because we don't want to get blown off that equity, or we don't want to be forced to put in a ton of money with like the wrong amount of equity. But that's okay. I think oftentimes people don't like this approach, or they feel like they're playing too weak by, I'm not making enough money with my top pair weak kicker. I'm not making enough money with second pair. I'm not making enough money with a weak over pair. That's not how you beat this player. I mean, it can be, and obviously, if we want to get more specific into how they play, maybe it is. Maybe you start delay c-betting turn with some of these hands that, you get put in a tough spot when they check raise, but they're only check raising 10% of the time. It's not 30% of the time, whatever the case may be. It depends how kind of crazy they are. But this player is going to lose money to you. The types of mistakes they're making, they're going to lose money to you when you have a good hand, and they're putting in way too much money, both with bluffs and with value hands. So you don't have to do anything. The way that you exploit them is actually just relaxing. You don't have to like outmaneuver them. Like, they check raise flop, and maybe they've got too many thin value hands and too many bluffs, and now you want to attack that range. And sure, you can do some of that, but the way to really beat them is not get into that spot in the first place. So against this player, polarized flop c-betting range, polarized turn betting range. We're just only betting with hands that don't mind getting raised for the most part, and take it from there. Obviously, you'll get to the river with some hands, like you'll get a lot of check bets. You'll have some strong value hands that can check bet, and if they check raise the river, you deal with it. But you haven't let them use maximum leverage against that portion of your range. When they're using maximum leverage by check bombing flop or turn, you've got a strong hand, and that's where you're going to make your money. So let's talk about Maniac number 2. Maniac number 2 forces in way too much money with good hands, with weak top pair, and sometimes open ender plus flush draw, sure, but they're not bluffing that much. They just, they call your 3-bet with 9s and your 200 big blinds deep, and the flop is 8-7-3 two-tone, and you see bet half pot and they like 5x raise with nines to get in 200 big blinds. That's this kind of player. They're just putting in a ton of money with pretty good hands and better. The easiest and most obvious adjustment to this player is once they put in a lot of money, fold unless you have a hand that beats a good portion of their value range. This player is going to, once again, lose money to you. Like when you have a very good hand and they have a pretty good hand, they're going to just give you all the money. They're going to make it easy on you. When you have a marginal hand and they have a pretty good hand, they're also going to make it easy on you because they're going to force in all the money. And now it's your job to just fold middle pair. It's your job to fold these hands that are just pure bluff catchers against a range that's not bluffing enough. Not only not bluffing enough, but then having way too many value bets, which means proportionally they're almost never bluffing. They make it pretty easy. And actually against this type of opponent, you can do some bet folding with value hands. Now it's kind of tricky because you don't want to get into a spot where they check jam turn for 5x pot and you have a hand that beats like, 5% or 10% of their value range, because you still have to fold that because 90% of the time you're losing. But it is unfortunate that you kind of like get bluffed off the best hand by a value hand. So be a little careful with those hands. But actually you can kind of do some more like thin value / protection betting on the turn with like second pair that just has a very clear fold to the raise because they're not bluffing enough. And now another thing to keep in mind is when this player check calls on the flop and or turn, remember that they are kind of ramming money in with thin value. So when they call, they don't have that thin value that they're supposed to have in their calling range. So now their range is weakened and you can bluff a decent amount. Actually, probably this type of opponent's going to overfold turns and overfold rivers because they're putting in so much money early with good hands. So yeah, this opponent, you don't have to take the same approach as Maniac number 1. It's actually a much different approach, even though both of them at the very beginning might present like players that are playing kind of the same way. So let's talk about Maniac number 3. Maniac number 3 loves to bluff. If you give this player rope, they're just going for it. Anytime they kind of get to the river with a hopeless hand in a big pot, if you give them a chance to bluff, they will. They love to, raise flop with weak semi-bluffs, strong semi-bluffs. They like to raise turn with weak semi-bluffs, strong semi-bluffs. They like to bluff the river when checked too. They like to bluff the river against small bets too, as well. This type of player usually doesn't like bluff raise river against big bets. They kind of they like to attack weakness, or they'll find themselves on the river with air because they bet twice, or like they see bet flop, you check call, turn goes check check, and now something hits on the river and they can't help themselves. Or they check called flop and turn goes check check, and now they can't. Whatever the case may be. Oftentimes, like they'll bluff raise flop. So the flop is 10-8-3. They're in position. You bet. They raise with like every gut shot. Then you call, and then the turn is a king, and it goes check check. Well, now they've started a bluff, but they've kind of given up on the turn because they don't like the turn. But now that they are checked to again on the river and they can't win by checking, they like to bet. So that's kind of the most obvious adjustment, is make sure that in a spot where it's very likely that they have air, give them rope. Let them bluff you. Kind of similar to Maniac number 1, and a little bit the case with Maniac number 2. We never want to slow play. We want to bet kind of polarized. We want to bet all of our strong hands. And we want to be a little bit careful with hands that have to that are in an uncomfortable spot against a check raise, basically. So like decent semi-bluff hands that really don't want to bet fold their equity. Even on like that 10-8-3 flop, a hand like King Queen, King Jack with a backdoor flush draw and all those backdoor straight draws, like you don't want to get check raised off of that by their 6-7 and all that stuff. So check more of those hands that have some hope and like some good turn cards. You can still bluff on the flop, of course. And this player, it starts to get. So what you're supposed to do is you actually still bet the right number of value hands, potentially even a little thinner, maybe not. And then when they check raise, you just grit your teeth and you call down, or you get the money in. A lot of people don't have the stomach for that, and so you actually can probably get 80%, 90% of the EV against this player by skipping those plays, just checking the flop when you're pretty uncomfortable to face a check raise and call down. You're going to make more money if you're right about this read by betting flop and calling down. But you're not making a ton of money. You know, they have better hands, they have draws that have reasonable equity against you. So yes, you're supposed to be betting and calling down because they're over bluffing, over semi bluffing, and barreling through often. But if you skip some of those plays, you're not going to lose that much EV as long as you're betting the quite strong hands. That's where they're just going to punt off the money to you. This type of player actually, when they check call, they more often have a made hand than a draw. I mean, it depends how loose they are. Sometimes they just call with, like high card and backdoor draws because they're super loose. Or other times they check raise so many of their draws, and when they check call, they have middle pair or top pair. So hand read accordingly. And, against this player, let's just use the same 10-8-3 board. You see bet flop, they call, turn pairs the 8. Against some opponents, bluffing, whatever, 7-6 works out well because they have to check fold their queen jacks and their flush draws and things like that. Against this player, that they probably raised a lot of those hands on the flop. So now actually they hit the 8 pretty hard, and they have like 10s and 8s pretty often as well. So those semi bluffs on the turn aren't going to work as well against them. But yeah, most of the money comes from betting good hands and then letting them give you a lot of money when you've got a good hand. And then the last one, which I think I touched on, but when you get to those river spots where they're likely to have air, make sure you're not betting big. You can bet small to try to induce bluffs, or you can check to try to induce bluffs, but look for those spots to induce bluffs on the river rather than going for kind of thin value. Generally speaking, obviously hand read, every situation is different. Use your poker abilities. Don't just blindly follow this strategy against anyone who loosely fits this description on every board texture. But yeah, that's how I would approach it. Generally, when you sit down at the table and somebody's clearly putting a lot of money into the pot, but you haven't figured out which kind of maniac they are, just play tight ranges and polarize ranges. So again, assume that you're going to get raised too frequently and bet hands that are comfortable getting raised, whether they're, bluffs that can just bet fold or very strong hands that want to get raised. And as you play with this player over time, pay attention to their showdowns, see if it seems like they're the over bluffing type or if they're just ramming in too much money with pretty good hands, and then you can make the adjustments I talked about in the video. If there's another type of maniac that you've had trouble with, let me know in the comments. I will let you know how I would handle it. I'll see you in the next video.